Hello, Fred.
Hello, Catherine.
How are you?
Fine. I don't think I've met you before.
You haven't, but I've heard lots about you.
Oh, that's scary.
No, never, never. And I'll get to meet you in person in 2 weeks when I come to your class at Ollie.
I don't think so because I live in Texas.
Really?
Yeah, I'm a long distance student.
Oh, okay. Didn't realize that.
Yeah.
All right. Is anybody else with us today?
Hey, gang.
Chris just signed on. How are
Hey,
you,
John,
Chris?
how are you? Good. That unfortunately still at work. So,
Oh, you're still at work.
oh man, it's yeah, I got stuck in traffic for 4 hours running samples into Asheville today,
Oh
and
boy.
it's deadline for state reporting, so I'm trying to get that done. I'm
Yeah.
almost done. So, how are you doing?
Good. Next week when you see me, I'll be back in Texas.
Do you want to be? How's the weather?
Well, it's hot. Actually, it's amazing. It's been like 45 degrees, 46 degrees in the morning, and then heats up to about 88, something like that. So
Yeah,
extreme.
up here we're in the weather where you run your heat in the morning and your air conditioning in the afternoon.
Yeah.
It's like it was 54 when I left the house this morning and it hit 88.
Wow.
So
Very
yeah.
similar.
So where in Texas?
A place called McAllen, Texas.
I've heard of it, never been there.
It's right on the border.
Oh, okay. So is
Long
that your?
way south. Texas is a huge state.
It is. Takes almost a whole day. It takes the entire day to drive through it.
At
That's
least
right.
a day. Yeah, it's a big state.
So how you there permanently?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, who else will be on our meeting today?
Oh, there's Fred.
There's Fred.
And Rachel should be coming, and then Sue maybe. Sue's usually on by now.
Boy, it's September 10th already.
Tell me about it.
Wow.
Hey, Fred, how are you?
I don't think Fred's fully connected yet.
Yeah, I think I am. Can you hear
There
me?
you are. There you
There
are.
he is. Hi, Fred.
Yeah.
Hi, Fred.
Yeah.
There she is. She's coming.
Chris, how often do you have to submit samples to the state?
Depends on which system we're talking about. For my system, every day, I do sampling here and then report that to the state. And then we have monthly, quarterly, yearly stuff, just depends. Some stuff is every 3 years, some is every 5 years. Like lead and copper sampling is every 3 years, and we're doing that right now.
Oh, okay.
So
you have a complex schedule that you have to adhere to.
unfortunately, but I have this magical thing called a computer and a schedule, so I know when it's happening. And it works great because if I don't have my brain on my computer or my phone, I'll forget things.
Yeah. Well, only in the last few years did I have the luxury of having a computer give me reminders.
I don't know how I did it before. I carried little pieces of paper everywhere.
Right.
It was terrible. And then I'd leave them in my pants pocket and get washed or something
Yeah.
else. But then I had other people to help me remember. So that was always nice.
Rachel signed on?
She's there. She's just hiding behind the black screen.
There she is. I see her.
Okay. Okay. So we'll give it another minute or two, just see if we have any stragglers.
There's Rachel.
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, there's Sue.
Hello.
Hey
Hi,
there.
Sue.
Hello, Sue.
Okay. Okay. Harold's not going to be here this week. He's out. He's in California doing something. So I think all the regulars are here. So
All
we
right.
can start. Yeah, the portion. Yeah.
Before we start, I have a question that has nothing to do with tonight's reading.
Okay.
I have watched several programs on anti-Semitism, and I don't really understand why we are so hated. So I'm wondering if any of you, Fred obviously especially, but the rest of you, have any thoughts that could enlighten me.
This could be
There's,
like a whole year's worth of classes, I think.
yeah, there's stacks of books written on that, and no one's figured it out yet.
Okay.
Um,
Well, I mean,
that's
Sue, from as far as like, I mean, not to step on Fred's time, I know he's limited, but I mean, there's always somebody who needs to be the other. And we've always been the other because we're kind of insular, tend to be anyway, historically, but they made us that way. You know, when they kept it like back in the Middle Ages and before, when they kept us out of like regular society and regular jobs. And that's just been the thing. They need somebody to blame for their problems, and we're convenient. If it wasn't for us, it'd be somebody else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's always got to be a punching bag. And unfortunately, you don't have any of the other, this is just my opinion. The Jewish population in the United States has had a great history, very notable history. However, people find it a convenient punching bag today because there's no repercussions from it.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of to me, the bottom line.
I might add, actually, there are some people who say that it really goes back to the biblical times. If you remember the story, and I think we covered this before, that in the book of Numbers, where the Israelites are going through the desert and they pass through Moab, and Balak, who's the king of Moab, for some reason doesn't like them, and he hires Bilam, who's a famous sorcerer of the time, to come curse them. And according to the story, God actually turns the curse into a blessing. He forces Balaam to bless the Jews. And if you actually read the text, most of what he says is favorable. It's that famous line about how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. But in the middle of all that, there's one very ominous line where he says, a people that will dwell alone, not to be reckoned among the nations. And the Hebrew word actually that it's used for alone is vadad, which has the connotation of cut off, isolated. Um, You really wonder if in the middle of that blessing that may have been the most accurate prophecy anyone has ever made about the Jewish people, that Jews are never going to be normal in that sense. And the early Zionists said, the real problem with anti-Semitism is we've been living in diaspora for too long. We don't have our own country. We've always been in somebody else's country. And once we have our own country, then we'll be normal again. And obviously, the state of Israel is anything but normal. Um, People regularly question Israel's right to exist. Nobody questioned Nazi Germany's right to exist. Nobody questioned Stalin's Russia's right to exist. Nobody questions Mao Zedong's China's right to exist. There's something about Israel that is just it's not reckoned among the nations. Maybe that's what being chosen means. Who knows? Some rabbis have thought that.
But Fred, one of the things that bothers me immensely is that I thought we were over all of that. I mean, sure, there's always, people make Italian jokes. You got to be self-deprecating to,
Right.
and I think when you hear that, but what we see today is totally inexcusable.
Yeah.
And it's a lack of the government doing what the government needs to do, whether it's city, colleges, or what have you. That we've got to get beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a hopeful sign. Several of the new college administrations, I think are ready to take the problem on. There've been a number of changes, presidents of a number of elite universities because of what's been going on, and we'll see what happens. But again, there are some rabbis who would tell you maybe this is one of the things we're chosen for. Who knows?
I mean,
And
I'm even okay with people protesting on campus. That's what campuses are for. But don't shut down our side of the argument. Don't let the Students for Palestine come in and set up their camps and have their Jew free zones. Oh, sorry, their anti-Zionist free zones. Excuse me. And then keep the Jews on campus from going to class. I mean, anyway, sorry.
Yeah. Well, actually, I should add, as my favorite political philosopher, Bill Maher, said a couple of weeks ago, he said, all those kids who are out there, standing up for Gaza, demonstrating for Gaza, none of them would last a week in Gaza.
That's right.
Yeah, but they have no idea what it's like to live under Hamas government. Okay.
True that.
Okay. Anyway, we should get on with the subject for the week.
With the subject at hand. Sorry to do that.
Right.
Did we help you, Sue?
Maybe.
Yeah. The reading this week, we read this coming Shabbat. It starts on Deuteronomy chapter 23 with verse 8. And it's kind of a strange reading because it's about a dozen different laws, none of which have any relation to each other, that are just tossed in together. They're just kind of a salad. But you don't really know why the writers of the Torah did this. You think they'd organize the laws into related areas, but they didn't. It's just one follows another, and they have no apparent relation to each other. But the first reading for this coming Sabbath, the first Aliyah, is verses 8 through 12 of chapter 23. Somebody want to go ahead and read that?
Sure.
Okay.
Children born to them in the third generation may enter the assembly of the Lord.
No, it's a little bit earlier though. It says you shall not reject an
Oh,
Edomite.
okay. You shall
Yeah.
not abhor Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you are a sojourner in his land. Children born to them in the third generation may enter the assembly of the Lord. When you are encamped against your enemies, then you shall keep yourself from every evil thing. If any man among you becomes unclean because of nocturnal emission, then he shall go outside the camp. He shall not come inside the camp. But when evening comes, he shall bathe himself in water, and as the sun sets, he may come inside the camp.
Obviously, there's a number of different unrelated things, even in this short, reading. The first one, we say you shall not abhor an Edomite because he's your brother. This is literally true because Edom, if you remember the map we showed a couple of weeks ago, Edom is the area to the south of Judea in biblical Israel, and it's Esau's land. The name comes from the Hebrew Adom, red, because Esau was the red hairy twin in Genesis. And so it's literally true. The Edomites are your brother. But it's really funny that the later rabbis, though, really decided to portray Esau as really being evil. And if you read the text in Genesis, Esau really is a pretty decent guy. I mean, he's kind of crude and he's impulsive, but it's Jacob who's the sleazy one. Jacob is the one who cheats him out of his birthright. And you remember the when Jacob is returning from his uncle Laban, coming home with his wives and children and everything, and he has to meet his brother Esau again. And Esau has his own militia. He has 400 armed men. He can easily kill Jacob, take everything he has. There's nothing to stop him. And yet it's Esau, who really reconciles with his brother. I think to me, Esau is the brother who's acting nobly. But the later rabbis of the Greco-Roman period decided that Esau was going to be a symbol of evil. And that's the way you see him portrayed in the rabbinic writings. For instance, during the Roman period, Esau is a code name for Rome. During the medieval period, Esau was the code name for the church. It was just really a symbol, of everything that was an enemy of Israel. Even though, again, I think, a neutral reading of the book of Genesis wouldn't lead you to that conclusion. The second one, of course, is Egypt. And that really sounds strange because, the Egyptians enslaved us for 400 years. Why would you like the Egyptians? Well, the rabbinic commentators, their reasoning was, initially at least, but there was a famine in Canaan. When Jacob's family was starving, the Egyptians took them in. It went sour later on when a new pharaoh took the throne, but at least initially, the Egyptians did save Israel, save them from starvation by taking them in. The other thing, which is kind of interesting, I hadn't thought of it until I read one of the commentators, is there may be some guilt involved there. Because even though, when we tell the Passover story, we talk about slavery in Egypt, but one thing that's frequently left out is the fact that initially Joseph enslaved the Egyptians. We don't usually think about that. I think it'd be worthwhile. Turn back to Genesis chapter 47. If you look at Genesis 47, verse 13, there's a description there that goes from verse 13 to verse 25. Would someone like to read that?
Sure. Now there was no bread in all the world, for the famine was very severe. Both the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered in all the money that was to be found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan as payment for the rations that were being procured. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's palace. And when the money gave out in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone." And Joseph said, "Bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock if the money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks of sheep and cattle, and the asses. Thus he provided them with bread that year in exchange for all their livestock. And when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We cannot hide from my lord that with all the money and the animal stocks consigned to my lord, nothing is left at my lord's disposal save our persons and our farmland. Let us not perish before your eyes, both we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread, and we will have our land, and we with our land will be serfs to Pharaoh. Provide the seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. So Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh, all the Egyptians having sold their fields because the famine was too much for them. Thus the land passed over to Pharaoh. And he removed the population town by town from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not take over, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh had made to them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, whereas I have this day acquired you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land. And when harvest comes, you shall give one fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be yours as seeds for the field and as food for you and those in your households and as nourishment for your children. And they said,
We can stop with that. You
Okay.
see what basically is happening. You have the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine. The idea was, they pile up all this grain during the 7 good years. But then what Joseph does, rather than giving them back the grain which they had produced, he's selling it to them. And when they run out of money, they have to give them their livestock. And when they run out of that, they have to give them their land. He basically makes them slaves of Pharaoh by selling them back their own grain, which they produced. And so, the thing is not totally one-sided. We enslaved the Egyptians in a sense before they enslaved us. And some of the later rabbis thought that part of this business about not abhorring an Egyptian is sort of that we felt guilty, because it wasn't all one-sided. We enslaved them before they enslaved us.
Hmm.
And then the business about the third generation, apparently the plan was that if an Egyptian or an Edomite, lived among the Judeans for 3 generations, then they were eligible to become part of the Jewish people. We don't really know what conversion consisted of in the biblical, era, exactly how it was done. But apparently you had to have lived there for 3 generations, and then you were eligible to become a full-fledged member, of Israel. That's sort of how it worked. Um, and then the last part of it, which obviously is totally unrelated to what came before it, is the business. When you're in a military camp going to war, and you have to remember that this is a holy place. And so anyone here, they give it as an example, a nocturnal emission of semen, which makes you ritually impure. So you have to go through this decontamination ceremony. But the basic idea is, that basically an army camp is a holy place, which is kind of startling when you think about it. An army camp is at the last place in the world you'd think would be a holy place. But this is the idea, that if you're fighting a war that God commands, the war is actually carrying out God's commandments if it's a just war. And therefore, you have to maintain an aura of holiness in the camp. Um, the only other example I can think of that, in the 17th century, the Puritan revolt against the British monarchy, the British Civil War, when Oliver Cromwell was commanding, the Puritan army, they actually had those kind of rules. They would have regular prayer meetings every day. They would sing hymns before at night. No prostitutes were allowed in the camp. They really believed they were a holy army, doing God's work. And it's very much the same idea, that goes into these kind of rules. And then 13 and 15 through 15 are really a follow-up on the same thing, keeping the camp holy. 16 through 19 again a totally different set of laws that deals with runaway slaves. So if someone wants to read 16 through 19.
Sure.
Okay.
You shall not hand over to his master a slave who escapes to you from his master. With you he shall stay in your midst, in the place that he chooses, within one of your gates, wherever is good for him. You shall not mistreat him. There shall be no cult harlot from the daughters of Israel, and there shall be no cult catamite from the sons of Israel. You shall not bring a horse pay nor a dog's price to the house of the Lord your God for any votive offering, for both of them are the abhorrence of the Lord your God. You shall not exact interest from your brother, interest of
That's
oh
verse 20.
oh
That's way
okay, sorry.
back. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, the runaway slave thing is interesting because every society that we know about in the ancient world had just the opposite rule. If you caught a runaway slave, you were required to bring him back to his master. And not only the ancient world, in our own country, up until the Civil War, up until 1860, we had a fugitive slave law. So it was not just, it's not just biblical times. This persisted up into the 19th century. The Jew are required if a runaway slave was captured to bring him back. Now, there are two kinds of slaves, though, in Israel. There was the Hebrew slave. There were laws about that in Exodus. If you have a Hebrew slave, he only serves for 6 years, and then you have to let him go the seventh year. But slaves that you conquer in war from the other people around you, you can keep them as long as you want. And so we assume this probably applies to non-Hebrew slaves, because the Hebrew slave is going to be freed anyway in a few years, and would have really no reason to run away. The laws in Exodus are, if a master mistreats his slave, that the slave has to be freed. So if you have a runaway slave, you assume that it's not a Hebrew slave, it's one of the ones taken from another people. But it's really interesting. This is the only culture we know about up until the modern world that actually had a rule like that went against every other rule of every other country about slaves. Um, the other part of that last couple of verses, about having temple prostitutes, and this really was part of most ancient religions. They were actually professional prostitutes that were attached to the pagan temple. That term catamite really means a male homosexual prostitute. And that it was basically part of the service, which I guess is one way to attract members to your church, man. If that's one of the services that you're offering.
Mhm.
But that's forbidden to the Israelites, so they have to find other ways to get members, to come to the temple. And then with verse 20, they switched to a totally different subject, verses 20 through 24. If somebody wants to read that.
Sure, 20 through 24. You shall not deduct interest from loans to your fellow Israelites, whether in money or food or anything else that can be deducted as interest. But you may deduct interest from loans to foreigners. Do not deduct interest from loans to your fellow Israelites, so that your God may bless you in all your undertakings in the land that you're about to possess. When you make a vow to your God, do not put off fulfilling it, for your God will require it of you, and you will have incurred guilt. Whereas you incur no guilt if you refrain from vowing. You must fulfill what has crossed your lips and perform what you have voluntarily vowed to your God, having made the promise with your own mouth.
The interesting, but it's interesting. There are two Hebrew words that the Torah uses for interest. One of them is neshech, and that's the one that's used in this particular section. And neshech means to bite. It's interest from the debtor's point of view. The other Hebrew word, which isn't used here, is harbit, which means to increase, which is interest from the creditor's point of view. And the idea was that you're not to charge interest on loans, but the problem was, these laws, were first put down. Basically, the Israelites were nomads, with flocks and herds. And so essentially, in that kind of society, there's not much need for financial services. The issue really doesn't come up. But later when they finally were settled in the land of Israel, and you had a commercial society, then obviously you can't run that kind of society without credit. There has to be a financial system, there has to be interest. And the rabbis finally came up with what they thought would be a solution for that. To them, there were two kinds of loans. One was a personal loan, and that loan was given to a fellow Israelite, who needed money for personal reasons. And that's the one that you're not allowed to charge interest on. But the other would be a business loan. And that, to them, that's a different kind of loan. And that you are allowed to charge interest on. So, for instance, if a friend really borrows money from you, if he needs money, for medical expenses or for some repair he needs on his house or whatever, and you're lending him the money, you're really doing it to not to make money on the loan, but to help him out. And so basically, by not charging interest, you're basically making it sure, just helping him. On the other hand, is let's say if you buy a General Motors bond, you're not doing that because you have warm, fuzzy feelings for General Motors and you feel you ought to help them meet their capital need. You're buying the bond because you want the income. So that would be a different loan. And the rabbis of the Roman period set up a whole bunch of rules about that, how you distinguish a personal loan from a business loan. Also, they said that the no interest thing only applies to fellow Israelites. You're allowed to charge foreigners interest on the loans. So, and this became an issue really in Europe in the Middle Ages because the Catholic Church, did not really disapproved of interest also. They didn't like the idea of Christians charging other Christians interest. But again, in a society, somebody has to do it. There has to be a financial system. And so they figure the Jews would be ideal for that. The Jews were allowed to lend to non-Jews, so it didn't go against any Jewish laws. And also, since the interest was considered evil and a sin, let the sin be on the Jews. And so the Jews, got the role of being money lenders, in medieval Europe. And basically, a lot of the prejudice against Jews, Jews as being obsessed with money or Jews having this special talent for manipulating money, really comes from that the medieval situation where Jews were designated as the money lenders so that Christians wouldn't have to do it. The irony is, though, that there were a number of Christian bankers that defied the church and charged interest anyway. And the biggest bankers, really, in the medieval period, were not the Jews. They were people like the Medici, in Italy, the Fuggers in Germany. Most of the great bankers of the medieval era were Christians who defied the church and charged their fellow Christians interest. So.
But it almost sounds like then what the Catholic Church was doing was basically applying this rule to their tribe, just
Mhm.
as the Jews applied this to their tribe.
They were, yeah. Yeah, it really wasn't until the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants decided to throw the whole thing out. They decided there's nothing wrong with interest. And so, it was basically a Catholic teaching, and it didn't carry over into the Protestant countries after the Reformation. The other part of that reading of the business about vows, which is pretty obvious. They just say if you make a vow, you have to keep it. But there's really kind of an inference there that you're better off not making vows at all. You remember one of the commandments, the third commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And the rabbis felt really, you should never make a vow to God unless there's a real reason for it. I mean, if you resolve to do something, just do it. You don't have to take a vow to God in order to make yourself do it. In fact, even in the rabbinic courts, the Talmud has a whole long system, long discussions about how a trial should be conducted. And the idea is that you should avoid swearing anybody in if you can at all avoid it. If there's any way to conduct the trial without having to swear any witnesses, then that's the best way to do it. You just want to avoid any taking of God's name, if it isn't absolutely necessary. Um, which really brings up the one subject, particularly since we're getting to the holiday season. The probably one of the most famous prayers in the liturgy is the Kol Nidre prayer, which begins the Yom Kippur service. And here, Kol Nidre, all our vows. What they're basically saying is, may God forgive us for all the vows, which we make But the odd thing about Kol Nidre is that it's written in the future tense. You can understand, someone saying, "May God forgive us for all the vows we made over the past year, and for one reason or another we were unable to keep." But that's not really what Kol Nidre says. It says, "May God forgive us for all the vows we're going to make in the coming year." And this actually, during the Middle Ages particularly, was something the anti-Semites latched onto very quickly. They said every year the Jews go into their synagogues and they ask God to forgive them for all the lies they're going to tell and all the cheating they're going to do in the year that comes. Although most scholars believe that the real origin of Kol Nidre was really in medieval Spain. The Sephardic Jews during the time of the Inquisition in Spain, many of them were forced to convert, to Catholicism in order to stay in Spain. And so what they were really saying when they recited the Kol Nidre is, in this coming year, I'm going to have to go to Mass every week. I'm going to have to say prayers I don't believe to keep my cover. I'm going to have to go to confession every week, which means I'm going to have to lie to the priest. And I'm asking God to forgive me in advance for all that. That's really, the origin of the Kol Nidre. But it really became a very controversial subject. In the 19th and even early 20th century in Europe, there were some congregations that didn't say it on Yom Kippur. Their rabbis felt that it really should not be said. So it really remained a controversial prayer for a long time. Okay, then the next reading, the fifth Aliyah for this coming service, our verses is verse 25 and going on through chapter 24, verse 4. If somebody would like to read that.
Okay, I'll go ahead. If you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. She departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of the house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord.
Yeah.
And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance.
Yeah, the divorce thing, which is it's always been controversial in Judaism because it's always, as you see here, it's always the prerogative of the husband. A husband can divorce his wife. A wife can't divorce her husband. And that's true even in the modern world. It creates a lot of problems among the Orthodox. In an Orthodox community, if a wife wants out of a marriage, she can get a civil divorce, but she's not considered really divorced by that community unless she also gets the religious divorce. It's called a get is the usual term for it, and the husband has to give the get. And this is a source of really a lot of unfairness because basically the husband can withhold the get, and if there's arguments about, division of assets or custody of children, the husband can use that as leverage to hold over the wife. He won't give her the get unless she agrees to what he wants. Some modern Orthodox rabbis have actually created a workaround for that. what they do, what the document that you sign when you get married is called a ketubah, and it's really the equivalent of the wedding vows at a Christian wedding. It's usually you undertake to love each other, honor each other, take care of each other, etc. What some modern Orthodox rabbis have done is actually make the ketubah into a prenup, where there's a clause written into it that if the marriage should end in a civil divorce, the husband is obligated to also give his wife the get, the religious divorce. So that's settled right away at the time of the wedding. Yeah. For those of you who are Law and Order rerun fans, one of the great Law and Order episodes actually is built on that. It involves a Orthodox woman from Brooklyn, whose husband is a gangster who is serially cheating on her, and she finally has had enough. She gets a civil divorce, but he refuses to give her the get, the religious divorce. And so what she does is hire one of his associates to whack him. And so now she's a widow, and that solves the problem. And, and
Perfect.
and she actually gets away with it. It's one of the rare times Jack McCoy doesn't get a conviction on Law and Order.
I mean, would you convict her?
Yeah, yeah. Now the other thing though that this verse has here, that if a woman is divorced and marries another man, her husband is not allowed to take her back if that second marriage doesn't work out. Her second husband dies or there's another divorce, she cannot come back and marry her first husband again. Um, and it seems one of the prophets actually uses that law as part of the way he envisions it. I think it's Jeremiah, but I'm not exactly sure. I don't remember exactly. But he considers the covenant between God and Israel to be a kind of marriage. And if an Israelite goes off and starts worshiping idols, in a sense, he's divorced himself from God and now is married Baal or whichever idol he's worshiping. And then he asks the question, should God take him back again? Isn't the situation analogous to a wife who's divorced from her husband and marries someone else, meaning the pagan god? And should God take Israel back after that?
Hmm.
Yes, it's an interesting question. Um, and then number six, the sixth reading extends from verses 5 through verse 9. If someone wants to read that.
Yep. Okay, 5 through 9. When a man has newly taken a woman into his household as his wife, he shall not go out with the army or be assigned to it for any purpose. He shall be exempt 1 year for the sake of his household, to give happiness to the woman he has taken. A handmill or an upper millstone shall not be taken in pawn, for that would be taking someone's life in pawn. If a party is found to have kidnapped and then enslaved or sold a fellow Israelite, that kidnapper shall die. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. In case of a
Right.
skin, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
In cases of a skin affection, be most careful to do exactly as the Levitical priests instruct you. Take care to do as I have commanded them. Remember what your God did to Miriam on the journey after you left Egypt.
So again, there are two unrelated things that are packed into just this small section. The interesting thing again is, the idea that slave trading is forbidden. One of the main reasons for war, really, in the ancient world, in and out of the Bible, is to get slaves. A lot of the ancient wars were really just large-scale slave raids, and so what most of the modern rabbinic interpreters of this say is that basically slavery was kind of an institution of the ancient world. They didn't feel they could abolish it completely, but they tried to hedge it in as much as they can. There was if it's a Hebrew slave, you can't have him for more than 6 years. If it's a runaway slave from outside Israel, you're not allowed to return him to his master. And now you hear you're not allowed to trade in slaves. You're not allowed to sell them. And anyone who actually kidnaps someone to enslave them, actually it's a capital offense. So that even though they never actually outlawed slavery completely, it's really the only culture in the ancient world that tried to reduce it to the absolute minimum that they could. Because, one of the most profitable professions in the ancient world was slave trading. It was really it was really a great business to be in. And even really up until the 19th century, one of the main highways in Greenville is called Wade Hampton Boulevard. And Wade Hampton, who was actually a general during the Civil War in the Confederacy, but he was also one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina, and he made his fortune on slave trading. I'm really amazed that, nobody's petitioned to have the name removed from the highway yet.
I mean, all the Wade Hampton, everything out there, they'd be coming up with a
Yeah.
lot of new names.
The other thing that they talk about here is the skin infection, and that really just goes back to Exodus, when they talk about leprosy. And, if you wake up with this rash, you have to go see the priest, and there's a whole rigmarole with that. And the reason they mention Miriam is that episode, I think it's in the book of Numbers. For some reason, Miriam and Aaron are mad at Moses because he's married a Cushite woman, an Ethiopian woman. And it's not clear whether this is racism or they don't like her for some other reason or whatever. And they complain about it. And God gets angry and strikes Miriam with leprosy. And Moses prays, on her behalf, and and she's cured. But this is really what they're referring to in these verses. And then the last reading would be verses 10 through 13. So
Fred,
someone will read that.
Fred,
Yeah.
I have a question. If you were a farmer in Israel, were all the farms run by slaves, or did they have other people working for them for a fee? I mean, they don't mention anything about workers in this section.
But as far as we know, it was both hired workers and also slaves who worked the fields. Um, we know that people hired workers for the harvest. You remember the book in the book of Ruth. Ruth goes out to Boaz's field, and he allows her to glean the grain. That his young men are harvesting, and we assume these really are hired laborers. But also, one of the things you would assign a slave to do, is to help you work your field. So it probably was both, hired workers and slaves.
Okay.
Yeah. Someone want to read 10 through 13?
Sure, I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
When you make your neighbor a loan of any sort, you shall not go into his house to collect his pledge. You shall stand outside, and the man to whom you make the loan shall bring the pledge out to you. And if he is a poor man, you shall not sleep in his pledge. You shall restore to him the pledges as the sun sets, that he may sleep in his cloak and bless you, and it shall be righteousness for you before the Lord God. You shall not oppress the hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of your sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and
That's far
counselor.
enough. Yeah,
Okay,
it's really far enough. Yeah, what they're really saying here is, if you're lending it to a poor man, usually all he has to give you for collateral would be his cloak. And usually for a very poor person, that's what he sleeps in. He may use that as a blanket at night. And so, number one, you're not allowed to embarrass him by coming into his house to take it. You're doing this in front of his family, and he's being humiliated, by having to give away his only piece of outerwear really to you. And so, to avoid embarrassing him in front of his family, you wait outside, and he comes out to you. But the other thing is, if he's really poor and this cloak is all he has, and he needs something to cover himself with at night, you've got to come back every day and return it to him. And of course, what this works out to in practice, it's much better just not to take it in the first place, rather than have to come back every day, give it back to him, come back and take it again in the morning. And so the real point of all this is, if he's really a poor man, don't ask for collateral. Just go ahead and make the loan. Um, but the interesting thing is, as one modern rabbinic commentator this has pointed out, and what the rabbi tried to do is to make it as easy as possible for a poor man to get a loan. Now, the fact that you wouldn't want to take collateral from him if it was hard for him, that you wouldn't charge him interest on the loan, if it's a personal loan. And so everything was done to try to make it as easy for the poor, to borrow money as possible. In our own system today, it's just the opposite. The wealthier you are, the easier it is to borrow money. If you have assets, if you have stocks, if you have a house, if you're financially sound, any bank will lend you money, at a fairly decent rate. If you don't have any assets, if you have really no real collateral, then you're stuck with going to one of these payday loan places or title loan places, and paying 30 or 40 or 50%, to get a loan. So we've actually reversed the whole thing. We've made loans easy for the wealthy and hard for the poor.
Fred, the use of sojourner in here, that would lead me to believe that when it came to harvest of crops, it was just like the migrant farm workers. You had people that would follow the crops and have no tie to that person's farm or land, and just work for the period of time, and then go someplace else and do something else. So,
because actually, that's really how a lot of people became enslaved. Let's say you have a farm and you're putting in a crop this fall. Well, you often have to borrow money for seeds, for tools, to hire people to
yeah,
work the fields, and you're borrowing it against the crop, that you're going to get the next spring. And let's say there's just a really bad weather or a drought or whatever, and the crop doesn't come in. Well, how do you pay back the debt?
yeah,
You've either got to sell part of your land, and that's one thing that they did. And the Jubilee year thing was an institution so that you have a chance to buy your land back to get it back. You've had to do that. Or, if your land wasn't worth enough to satisfy the debt, then you literally sold yourself.
yeah.
And that the rule was, what they called it a slave, but it's really more like we would call an indentured servant.
Mhm.
You were working off a debt. And the longest you could be asked to work for that was 6 years. You had to be let go on the 7th year. That's really how the system worked. Um, Anybody have any comments or questions about what we covered?
They mentioned that if an escaped slave was found, you weren't supposed to return it. Is that where you think a lot of the abolitionists got their idea for the biblical idea of being anti-slavery prior to the Civil War?
I think it was, yeah. And a lot of the early abolitionists, both in America and in England, where they got rid of it before we did, were evangelical Christians. In England, it was abolished in the 1830s. A guy named Wilberforce. I can't remember his first name, but he was an evangelical Christian who really did it as what he felt God required him to do. And a lot of the northern abolitionists were ministers. There really was a very strong religious component of the abolitionist movement.
Fred, a kid I went to college with, his father was indentured to come from Italy to work in the coal mines in Pennsylvania. This was in the late 1800s. He escaped after, I guess he was young teenager. He said, you know, this
Mhm.
isn't for me. And took off. And there was actually a warrant out to arrest him and return him.
Mhm.
But he made it all the way to California to escape that process. So
Right.
despite all the talk about slavery, I'm guessing that was true of a lot of the poor immigrants who came to the United States. I've understood from some Irish people that they would indenture themselves to come over here to pay for the travel.
Pay for the travel, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody paid your fare and you had to work it off.
Yeah.
But often, if you read accounts of that, the conditions they worked under were just horrendous.
Oh, horrific.
It was basically slavery.
Yeah, it was just like this. His father was a mid-teen, let's say 16, 17 years old.
Mhm.
And you know, that's what he did, is worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Before we go, let me give you the reading for next week if anybody wants to read ahead. Let me skip it.
Okay,
Let's see. We're still going to be in Deuteronomy. Next Saturday will be the 21st. Okay, let's see. September 20. Yeah, so next week, the reading for Saturday after next is that we're still in Deuteronomy, and it begins on chapter 26, verse 12, and it goes through chapter 28, verse 6.
okay,
Sounds good.
good.
Okay, so
Good
see
luck
you
with your
guys next
water
week.
samples, Chris.
Thanks, John. Take all the help I can get.
Okay,
Thanks, Fred. See you, gang.
Talk to you later.
okay, bye,
Thanks,
guys.
Fred.
Bye, Sue.
Thank-
Have a good one.
Thank you all.
See you.